Again, as I told you before, this is how we've often ended these panels, these sessions, because what journalists have to say is often very well articulated. They're keen observers of what's going on out there, and we enjoy getting their feedback not only about what they're doing, but maybe even what they've seen while they've been here this week. One last thing I want to say, Michael Kimmelman, who was just on the stage, has a book which you should get, which details his experience in the city of New York with various designers or engineers or others, which explains why what we're seeing in the built environment. So a little plug for Michael, because he has built narratives around data, and that's a really beautiful book around narratives that just came out. So I'd like to kick it off with my friend Joanna Allhands, who's sitting to my left, as an example of why I like these people up on the stage. So it was maybe a month ago that in an opinion piece, and Joanna will tell you about her work, everyone will introduce themselves to some extent by virtue of what they say first. It included something you've heard a lot about here, the Colorado River, and it showed a chart that had 3 scenarios available to us all over the next 2 to 3 years. One of which was, yeah, it's not great, but this is what's going to happen. This is concerning. And this takes you to Deadpool, and I think it was 2024. So someone has put in the Arizona Republic a graph that says your 40% of the water that you get in the city of Phoenix could go to Deadpool and thus maybe be unavailable to you in 2 years for the 5th largest city. And you heard other people talk about issues like that. And I was thinking, and I wrote her immediately, what kind of reaction do you get to that? You would think your readers' hair would be on fire and they'd be saying, what the heck is going on? Who's attending to this? So I'm curious about stories from all our panelists here, in whatever media they are. What kind of impact do you think they have? What did you expect? What do you want? Is it the job of journalists to raise public will? Does that need to be done somewhere else, maybe with people like Mayor Turner? So anyway, I'm going to let Joanna kick it off and then ask others to talk about stories or things that they've done in journalism that they can discuss in terms of intended impact, what really happened, and what do they think their role is for these big, big issues.
Right. So thank you, everyone. So I am an opinion writer. I do not write news. People get that mixed up all the time. All the time. Basically, every time that I write somebody back who engages with me via email, usually it's like, well, I read your article. And I'm like, well, I wrote an opinion column, and thank you. People get that mixed up that, I'm here not necessarily just to tell the story, but to say what should happen. And I'm there to give a viewpoint. Now, people often think that that means that I'm trying to convince you to agree with me. And that's actually not my goal. My goal is simply to give you a perspective that you could say, yeah, I totally buy that, or I don't buy that at all. You're so full of it. As long as there is the I agree with you because of X, Y, or Z, or I disagree with you because of X, Y, or Z. If the because of X, Y, or Z is in there, I did my job. Awesome. Great. So that's kind of my goal with writing things. And so I normally edit. That's my main job. In my spare time, I write. And mostly I write about water policy. Now, I don't write the stories that are the impactful, like, someone's lost their house and that sort of thing. I'm really delving into the weeds of policy and trying to translate that to folks as to what does that mean for you? And so, sorry that that's sort of the circuitous route to get to the piece that you're talking about, about what are these futures, and like, if we do not change what we do, including all of the things that we've already done to try to buy time on this problem of the Colorado River, we're going to hit Deadpool. Like, Deadpool means there is not water that goes past Hoover Dam, or if it's at Lake Powell, it doesn't go past Glen Canyon. That's huge, because that means no matter how senior your right is, and I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but no matter how senior your right is, you ain't getting no water. It is not going to come to you. That's a big thing. And honestly, you're seeing this in the discussions with reclamation, with the states, trying to figure out how do we fix this problem? And really, we're not even fixing the problem. What reclamation has said is, we're looking for this 2 to 4 million acre feet that you're going to have to cut in use that you're already doing right now. And oh, by the way, you're going to have to do it this year. And that doesn't fix anything. That just keeps the lakes from on life support, basically. That's basically what the officials are telling us. And so, how do you tell that story to people without them going, one, like, oh my God, we're all going to die, or two, well, this is just pointless. And I wish I had I really wish I had a good answer, because I've been asking pretty much everybody that I talk to as a source, saying, why is that not a motivating factor for people? We all know what's going to happen on the Colorado if we don't do something big, major. I mean, 2 to 4 million acre feet, it's like basically covering the entire city of Phoenix in 6 feet of water. It's a lot of water, and we're going to have to figure out how to not use that in like a year. Why is that not a motivating factor? Because if you don't, then you don't get any water anymore. And really what I'm hearing from people is, it's kind of smoke 'em if you got 'em. It really is. And honestly, I get it. I totally get it from, especially like I was just speaking with an advocate for farmers who, I was just kind of talking with him about this whole situation. And he was saying, look, farmers, because there's not profit in farming, really. You gotta have a good yield to be able to make a living. And they're saying, look, we could do 2 good years where I could get, a okay return on my investment and have an off-ramp, or I could do the right thing. I could conserve water, I could fallow land, I could, take the federal buyout, whatever, and eke by on 2 crappy years and still end up in the same spot. Why would I do that? And I wish I had a good answer for them.
Good. And so this is, if you will, 10 across in a nutshell. What do you know? What's certain going to happen in terms of the need to do something? That's the certainty. The question is, what will you do? And if you know stuff, as people have known in every one of these cities, about things that need to be attended to, how do you help get that public will? So this was just an example, and you're not knowing the answers and how this is going to work out is perfectly okay. That's why we're up here. We're sort of sorting through that. So Brendan, introduce yourself and a little bit about Jacksonville and a topic that you've been pressing where you're trying to see if something can be made to happen.
Sure. So I'm Brendan Rivers. I work at WJCT Public Media, so that's the NPR and PBS station in Jacksonville, and we have this project that we call ADAPT, and it's focused on telling stories about climate change and what's being done about it all throughout Northeast Florida. Most of my reporting is focused on Jacksonville and that city. And we've kind of experimented with a bunch of different types of storytelling. We've done videos, I've done a podcast, I do a newsletter now, and we do events about once every quarter where we try to get elected officials and subject matter experts in. We do panel discussions kind of like this, and we invite the audience to come engage with them and ask their own questions. So one of the stories I was really excited about recently, I did this a couple months ago in collaboration with Climate Central, which is a great organization. If you aren't familiar with them, I would suggest checking them out, and also one of our local TV stations. And the story was about electric vehicles and how a transition to electric vehicles would benefit Jacksonville. And of course, we talked about the climate benefits, but the story was more focused on the health benefits. And we spoke with a woman who lives in a predominantly black neighborhood, and her mother was struggling with some health issues that may have been linked to pollution. We spoke with medical experts, we spoke with a local doctor. We had a lot of sources, we referenced a lot of studies that kind of linked health issues with pollution from traditional combustion engine vehicles. And usually when I do these collaborations with Climate Central, those are some of our most read stories. Those get the most traction on social media. But this one didn't do as well as some of our other stories that we've done in collaboration with them. And when I went to the TV station site and I started reading through the comments, I know people say don't do that, but I can't help myself. I started to see a lot of pushback and a lot of misinformation. And honestly, since then, since I really learned a lot about EVs, I've just noticed so much misinformation out there about EVs and their benefits. And I guess that was one of the stories that was kind of disheartening to me, because I feel like, of course, there are issues. With every solution, there are issues. But people seem to be deliberately ignoring the possible benefits and the co-benefits. Yeah, so I guess that would be my example.
Okay. Perla. And by the way, it doesn't, as we talked about earlier, it doesn't have to be about climate change. It's how you're trying to articulate something where you want to see some reaction of some sort.
Yeah, so thank you for being here. Happy to be along this great group of journalists. I'm an investigative reporter for ProPublica, which is a national nonprofit news organization, and we're part of a team in Texas in collaboration with the Texas Tribune. So our team tries to focus on some of the most pressing issues in Texas, and as you probably have figured out, we keep ourselves pretty busy. I don't have a beat per se, but throughout my career, I've been focusing on border and immigration issues and environmental issues. I don't know what I'm trying to do to myself. One of the stories that I think affects a lot of the states that we're talking about is border and immigration, and we've been hearing a lot about it, not so far, and everything is intertwined and everything's connected, and all these issues compound each other. And so, as most of you probably have heard here in Texas, the governor has been focusing a lot on that issue. It has spent right now more than $4 billion on the Operation Lone Star. We've heard it from Arizona. We're not hearing it from Florida. And so we wanted to see what has been the impact of this operation. We keep hearing numbers about number of criminals arrested and immigrants apprehended and drugs seized. And every week the governor would go on these press conferences and tout this number. So we were asking for the data. Where are the numbers coming from? Can you back up the claims that you're making? And we partnered with the Marshall Project as well and put together a series showing that the rhetoric was not meeting the reality, showing that the numbers were not backed up by the data the governor's office was providing, that they wouldn't give us the records that we were requesting. We showed Texas has had over a dozen operations throughout the decades. Every time they launch one, the governor touts that this is the solution to the border security problem. This is what we need to invest to solve the problem. And yet, the state keeps finding itself in the same place over and over, and state lawmakers keep giving the state more money for such efforts. So it turns out that no one had compiled, no one could tell us how many operations we had had. So we put together this whole package of rhetoric versus reality. These are all the operations we could find. This is a story showing that the data does not back up the claims, and yet nothing much happened. I mean, we went on interviews on TV stations and radio stations. It got a lot of traction, but at the state level, very little has happened. And part of that is because if you follow polling for Texas residents, border immigration, time and time again comes up as one of the primary issues. And so, with environment and immigration, I think those are two topics where it's a challenge for academics, it's a challenge for media and the disinformation that sometimes you feel like you're putting it out in all sorts of different forms. You're doing radio, you're doing TV, you're doing data, you're doing people stories, and yet the message doesn't seem to be resonating. And I'm looking forward to the rest of this discussion to see if we can together come up with better ideas on pushing. And one thing I do think is that you have to keep reporting on the issue over and over again, just because it has been said before. Let's be creative. How else can we tell the story? Because if it hasn't been addressed, then it still merits repeating.
Mention just quickly, you said you're right, not talk about immigration enough. Your personal experience, you've really lived in Tenacross cities where this is happening. You want to just give a little more background on that?
Yeah, so I was born in Juarez, Mexico, across the city, across El Paso. I was raised in El Paso. I went to school in Austin. I was a border reporter in Arizona for 6 years. I was an environmental reporter here in Houston for a couple of years. Tennessee, although that's not part of the Tenacross, but
it has 10 in the name, though. So they count.
But I do think, that we often operate in silos, we either at states or beats or regions. And I think when we look at it across, the same issues that I was reporting on in Arizona are, you could report on them in Texas, you can report on them, the drought issues that we were talking about yesterday. If we find more commonalities and extending it, that, we're issues that we're all dealing, and even on both sides of the border. So how can we do more of that kind of, I'm a big fan of collaborations. I think for the most part, we work together. There's no sense in competing if we can put our resources together and have a broader reach. So I think from my personal experience, personal and reporting, I think, let's all work together more than we do.
Right. So Matt, I'm going to come to you next, but I'm going to finish with Justin over here because you have a different kind of thing to explain here than maybe the question I just asked. Justin, you have a comment about a story like what we were discussing?
Yeah, well, I think maybe what I'll do is just talk a little bit about what my beat is, and we'll get to two stories, and I'll be quick. But the way I frame my beat, I work for Time Magazine, and the way, if you look on the website, it'll say that I cover climate change and the intersection of politics, policy, and society. And sometimes people will say, what do you cover? Do you cover clean energy? Do you cover oil and gas? Do you cover effects of climate change? And I say, well, I cover all of that, and I try to think about the way that all of these things intersect, and all of these things intersect with stories that are outside of a typical climate beat to try to break down some of the silos that Perlin mentioned. And the reason why I've framed my beat that way is I had been doing the climate beat. This started covering climate 8 years ago, writing a lot of the same stories that my colleagues at other outlets in DC were writing, and I was just writing the same version with different people quoted or a slightly different thing. And I said, what's the point of this? Is this actually reaching people? Is this adding any value? Is it informing people in a new way? And I sort of reconceptualized what I did to try to find new stories that perhaps I thought would reach people in a different way, get them activated and thinking about climate slightly differently than they might have prior. And so just to give a few examples of what that means, I did a story about the Sandag regional plan. Sandag is not in the Tenacross, but 100 miles south of Los Angeles and San Diego, where they're reconceptualizing how they think about transportation, and there's a lot of sort of clear-cut climate stories about what this means for emissions. But I found this sort of interesting link between disinformation, sort of Trumpism, for lack of a better word, in one of the suburbs, and how this plan and a policy related to electric vehicles and attacks on road miles traveled had led to the election of a Trumper in a really blue suburb, and connected all of these dots in a way that I think a lot of people who are focused narrowly on, how do we cover the emissions impact, how do we cover, the sort of the city council story might have missed. And I got some good feedback from people in San Diego who said, oh, wow, I didn't really connect those dots. Nobody thought of it that way. Another example would be I did a story last year with Joe Neguse, who's a congressman in Colorado, in wildfire territory. And I spent time with him in the district, but instead of writing about the wildfire impacts, which a lot of people did in really compelling ways, and there's a lot of compelling visual stories, I wrote about the toll that event took on his time as a congressman. And he talked to me about, the challenges doing other things because he was so distracted by, this event that sucked up all his time. And I sort of posed the question, what does this mean, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, as we're facing extreme events and all of our leaders are so focused on the emergency happening? So just trying to activate people in different ways. I'll just close by saying, does it work? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There are other times when nobody reads and not nobody, but very few people seem to care. But I do think it's important to try to stretch the bounds of how people think about these stories, and that's been my focus.
Great. And Matt, I'm coming to you in what's slightly different about your contribution to this conversation. You're almost starting first with an audience that you're trying to reach, and then we get to the content. Tell us about what you're trying to do with NBCLX.
So NBCLX is about a little over 2.5-year-old streaming and broadcast network.
You might need to turn your mic, just bend it up a little bit. So
how about there? Ooh,
Whoops. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that to you.
That's all right.
There you
Is
go.
that
That's
better? Okay. NBCLX is about a little over 2.5-year-old streaming and broadcast network that's owned by NBC. It was invented to really be a research and development lab for the company, and a way to try and find younger audiences. So as we built it, we actually spent well over a year doing a lot of research and looking at what resonates with young people and what they want in television news. And it's not what you see at 11 o'clock and 5 o'clock. It's not Ron Burgundy either. But it is depth and context and getting to the why. So that kind of became the roadmap of the types of content and the topics that we go after. And thinking about what resonates and what doesn't really is a constant thing. Everything we do doesn't resonate, and then everything we do does. And I think what's happening in media right now is, particularly in television, is audiences are so fragmented, they're so spread out, there's so many choices, that the only way to get a message out is to have the repetition, have that story be told multiple times, multiple ways, so that more eyeballs are consuming it and getting the information. The other thing that drives our storytelling is what I like to call the shared experience. So the things that we all do, and that's sort of what drew us to the 10 Across project, is we all have to drive cars, we all have to buy food, we all have to deal with housing and cost of living. These are the kinds of things that resonate with people, and also what resonates is people. Stories are about people. And the success we see is when we can tell a great story through someone's eyes, and the viewer can either imagine themselves experiencing or one of their loved ones, but really have that connection to a person and what they're going through.
And the need to attend to a younger audience is, I'm sure, a business decision, as well as an expected different kind of engagement because of their facility with media. I mean, just probe that a little bit more about what it means to be going after a younger audience. What do you have to do in particular to make that
It's
work?
so hard. Because, when you say young, a millennial and a Gen Zer are very different. I think for us, it was refreshing to see one thing that both demographics do want is that depth and context and that understanding. It doesn't mean that you need to do, for television, that the stories need to be super long, but it means that there needs to be enough of information and contextual why, so to speak, that really drives the answer that they're looking for as to what is the problem and how it can be solved, and solutions as well.
Okay. So Matt, because you were on the stage previously, I'm going to weave you into the next big round. So people have gotten to know you a little bit better. They met Justin a little bit yesterday. Here's a question for you. Margaret Spellings was just over there saying data, data, data. We need the data. We had a whole session on Tuesday on water and data. Perla was just saying, hey, I've got data that conflicts with the stuff that you're giving me. Why aren't people listening? And a lot of people said, yeah, the data is one thing, but you have to build a story around it to get the public to read it. So your topic was about starting with data. Is data your friend or your foe? Is it this burden that you've got to carry? And Michael was talking about academia, building data, and maybe you have to add something to it to make it resonate. But the use of data, effectively using data, not drowning in data, not boring your audience with data, and they glaze over. So Matt, why don't we start with you? How helpful is that data?
I think one of the questions that the public, that any one of us faces when we see a statistic is, does it comport with our experience of reality? I think that's one of the ways that we evaluate. The truth is, we do not tell people things and then they believe them. We tell people things and then they check them against their own impressions of what they see happening in the world around them. And according to that, they decide whether they trust us or they don't. So part of the reason that I feel engaged in an effort to try to widen the public attention span and to try to focus on what are not just the symptoms of the problems, the intractable problems that have been created over decades, but what are some of the root causes and what are the systemic factors that are creating those problems to the point that we experience them acutely in our lives and they become part of our lived reality, is because I think part of the degradation in trust in institutions and certainly the degradation of trust in the media is a reflection of the fact that we point the camera at what's happening right in front of us, and for the folks who are most engaged with the problems, they see us missing all the things that happened leading up to that point. When I think about water, we launched Headway with a project called Hindsight, where what we wanted to do was we just wanted to ask, what were the projections or goals from 5 or more years ago of things that were expected to take place by 2020 or 2021 when we launched? And what happened? Did those projections or goals come true? One of the stories that we didn't do as part of Hindsight, but that I think about when I was listening to Joanna, was Lake Mead. You look back to 2000, to the year 2000, when you search the New York Times for stories from 2000 or 2001 projecting, raising projections for 2020 and 2021, one of the things that you would see is a projection that Lake Mead is going to run out of water in 20 years. In 2000, 2001, the Times and many other outlets before the Times were running stories that were sounding a warning that was coming to us from folks on the front lines, climate activists, from water researchers and scholars, from hydrologists and others, geologists, who were saying, our water use is not sustainable. At our current trajectories, we're depleting all of our aquifers, we're depleting our reservoirs at unsustainable rates, and we're going to begin to see problems. Lake Mead could be dry by 2021. One of the things that we do is we'll tell you that story, we'll sound that warning, and then we'll disappear for decades. And we, as the folks who are living around Lake Mead, are seeing the water tables drop, are seeing those levels narrow. That story, the way that we fix the public's attention on our challenges over time, that story recedes from the headlines, and then all of a sudden, we sound the alarm. I mean, most folks, most of the public encounters this as, oh, look at Lake Mead, it's filled with water. In 2000, you see this thing, it's full of water. The folks who are on the front lines of that problem know, oh no, this is painting a deceptive picture. The people whose lived reality encompasses the actual change in the water table, they have this perception of the problem changing over time, but we don't do a good job, I would say, in many of our institutions of telling that story progressively, telling that story over time, and pointing folks to, okay, it's 2003, water table's dipping. The one other story that comes to mind that makes me think of, August 1st, 2007, a bridge drops into the Mississippi River in Minneapolis at rush hour. Catapulting, among other things, a school bus and hundreds of vehicles at rush hour into the Mississippi River or onto the banks of the Mississippi River. The Star Tribune, I was at the time an editor at the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, and we were sort of not, we were doing tremendous breaking news coverage of the breaking of the bridge, but we were also sort of patting ourselves on the back a little bit because we had done a story in the paper that said structurally deficient bridges, that many of which were built after World War II, are at risk of actually collapsing. I think one of the ways that we have to change how we meet the public's attention with the stories we tell is figuring out how to bring people along with us in our fight against the problems that we're creating over decades.
Can I add something on
This is exactly what I want to happen.
And actually, that ties everything to what Matt said. So 2 projects that my colleagues at ProPublica have done that I think show this extremely well is that one is the black snow. So there was a everyone knew that there was an issue with sugarcane burning in Florida, and the communities who live there and the local newspapers had reported that whenever they burned it, there was all this pollution and all these problems that happened and nothing would change. And so together with through a program, we have the local report network, they worked. But this time, because it was like, it happened so fast that you couldn't really send someone there when they were burning to capture what was happening. So they, we have engagement reporters. So basically they're supposed to engage with the communities that we're writing about throughout the reporting process, not when we're done and we come back for a quote, but to have them, become part of what we do from the beginning and help shape what we do. And so they got them purple air monitors, so little monitors that whoever agreed to, they could keep around and track pollution when they burned the sugarcane. They also had a bot, and so people could text ProPublica whenever it was happening, what they're experiencing, what they smell like, what they were feeling, et cetera. And because I think the community was engaged from early on, because we had the data, not just research papers after the fact showing that, but real-time data that was being collected, actually change came about. And the lawmakers paid attention, and they're like, the EPA paid attention. And it's not because we didn't know the problem existed. It was a story that had been reported before, but thinking of a different way of reporting it. Another one is tax maps. And so, we all know there's cancer clusters. Houston is a prime example of that, the broader Houston area. But often nothing changes, right? We write the same story over and over and over again, and nothing changes. And so what my colleagues at ProPublica did, they grab all this data that had not been analyzed by the government in the way that they did, and they created this map where people could really see the clusters in their area, and did a bunch of stories throughout the country about it. And actually the EPA cited that work as a way to address the problems. I think this is where data can play an important role. It's not data just throwing out numbers at people and confusing them, but figuring out ways that you can use this data and incorporate it into the reporting and actually shake people to pay attention to the issue and bring accountability to what's going on.
And that data accumulated around air quality is so direct between the people experiencing it and your presentation of it. It's happening, as you mentioned, had to happen very quickly. It's maybe more trusted that something might have come out of an academic paper, which is opaque and it's hard to understand. Joanna, what do you make of what Matt just said? He predicted all this stuff decades ago, and the New York Times might be responsible for some of the loss of water. Sounds like they were behind it. Well, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean we've known since 2000 that this was an issue, and we've done many things over years, and to people's credit, for the things that we have done, we'd already be in Deadpool if we hadn't already done the amount of conservation and all the things that we've tried to do to help rectify the lake. The problem is that it's always been, let's just buy time. Let's just buy time. We're going to figure this out. Give us some more time. We need more time to figure out what to do. And so the problem is that we keep buying less and less time. So, the drought contingency plan came in 2019. We got about 2 years out of that. Then the 500+ plan came. All of these were things to try to get people to conserve because we were using more water than the river now produces.
And this parallels the energy transition, right? It's pretty much what we're doing, buying time. It parallels some things in healthcare and education, a whole bunch of stuff, mostly tend across things that are in high relief, and we don't want it to be such a grim story, but human nature is such that that's often our reaction.
It's easy to kick the can.
Tomorrow will be like today, I got a little more time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brendan, you're hearing all this. What do you make of it?
Well, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about the data thing. So
Please.
I am friends with an environmental psychologist, and I've been working with her on some projects recently. And she's been teaching me a lot about communication techniques and strategies and how you can use those to get people to change behavior to address issues like climate change. And this is something I'm sure everyone in this room has experienced. If you're talking to somebody who doesn't understand a complex issue like climate change, or they don't see it as something that we need to address, you're not going to change their mind by throwing facts and figures at them or just beating them over the head with information. The way you get through to those people is by finding shared values and appealing to those. And I think that's something a lot of journalists really struggle with, because I think journalists, we see a lot of things that other people don't have, or that other people don't see, so we kind of have some of these shared values about wanting to make sure people are aware of what marginalized communities are going through and what kind of things can help them, but I don't think most Americans are really thinking about issues that way. They're thinking about issues in a way where they really just care about how it's impacting them, about how it's impacting their children and their direct community. And I think data and hard facts, they're a great way to really illustrate the scope of these issues, but they're not great at making that connection for people. We need to really try to show why these things matter on an individual level and why people should care about them.
So,
Add to that
yeah,
real quick?
please.
Because along
That's the
data,
point.
and Matt said something I think that is important, that you want to take people along. You take them on the journey. And I think transparency in reporting goes a long way with the reader, the viewer, and especially with data. I mean, you know, when you have a great data project and you are able to give it as a tool to your audience, you know, the bridge data is a great example. If I can then go in and look at the data that you used to look at other bridges, I mean, I think we sometimes don't realize that our audiences want to have access to the same tools that we're using to tell great stories.
We're running out of time, but we're also the last session, so I'm going to ask for a little bit of leniency, and we had some space for closing remarks. The personal toll that it takes on you when you're writing stories that may have this aspect that we described earlier. Gosh, we're just buying time. We may not get there. And I asked the same question of President DeRoche yesterday. Students and anxiety as they're seeing these deadlines. Are we going to meet certain thresholds of reduce CO2 by 20, 30, 35? And I'm going to start with you, Justin, because you report on these issues at the international level as well, and you probably have a lot of colleagues in the business. When you're reporting on stuff like too little water, or are we going to do the energy transition, or homelessness, and you're confronted with a lot of difficult stuff, how does that impact you personally?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think personally, I find the work to be fulfilling, and I feel like, you know, while I'm a journalist documenting, I'm not an activist. It's still, I feel like there's a reason to get up and do this work, and that's what keeps me going and doing it, even if it's hard. I think there are moments when, you know, for me anyway, there are moments when I kind of get hit by it, and you sort of take a step back, even though for whatever reason that day is just the day when I realize, like, or when I'm struck by the sort of weight of it all, and got to take a step back and you know, take a break and try to get some time for reflection to get back and be able to continue doing the work, which is not to say I don't have a great answer, but I do think
That's a good answer.
Yeah, everybody I think feels it differently. Yeah.
Anybody else want to take that one on? We all don't have to do it, but anybody? Matt, you want to?
You asked about homelessness. I, as the editor of a project that I've just asked our reporters to talk to a lot of different people about experiencing homelessness, and many of whom, you know, some of whom are housing insecure and are at a kind of rock bottom personally for themselves. And I checked in with our reporters fairly constantly to ask, you know, how is this sitting with you? How are you doing mental health-wise in conducting these interviews? And part of what I've heard, which I think is very true and comports with my experience having edited investigations, is that truthfully, when you get to the people who are confronting and dealing with, and on the front lines of dealing with the most acute crises themselves, very often what you find is actually the sort of the reverse of what you might expect, that you are, I mean, certainly in talking with individuals who've experienced homelessness and the, again, nonsensical nature of what we create when we keep people on the street, you find a kind of creativity. I don't want to use this word unproblematically, but resilience, strength that they are tapping into in addressing the challenge. I think when you talk to folks in marginalized communities who are fighting to get from the margins to get equity for themselves in the society that we're creating, often I find that that's actually where you draw encouragement and comfort. I think about, we just did an issue I mentioned yesterday with the New York Times Magazine, where we looked at the aftermath of disaster. Now that we're in a state of ubiquitous and constant disaster, how do we think about rebuilding after disaster?
Well,
How do we
think about
differently
Rashida
disaster?
yesterday, who you
Yeah.
interviewed. I mean, what a story of resilience, and then beyond that.
It-
I mean, unbelievable.
What I come back to is Rebecca Solnit, A Paradise in Hell.
Yeah.
I mean, when you talk, she'd spent a lot of time looking at disaster, and she found that in the epicenter of these crises, when people have gone through the worst emergencies, acute emergencies in their life, is when something comes out of the human spirit that is, in fact, inspiring and motivating. And it draws you back into trying to tell the stories, not just of what they are suffering from, not the symptoms of the crises that we've created, but in fact, our capacity to meet those crises.
Let's hope that that is true. Be thinking of questions. We're going to come back to you. I was going to let the panelists offer a thought about that issue, a personal thing, but be thinking about a question. We'd love to have a few.
So I think more than what, to close before, more than how it affects me, I think to what Matt was saying and Rashida was saying yesterday, I think if we leave with anything throughout these days as journalists, as researchers, as just residents, is that to stop talking about these Black and brown communities as the victims of, I think a lot of our stories end up being with this poor community this poor community that, and not to say that that's not happening, but I think either do it through the solutions lens or spend more time in those communities where you show the complexities of the individuals or the residents. Because I think that's one way that the story feels old very quickly and people just roll their eyes because it's not surprising, unfortunately, anymore that this Hispanic community in Houston is in the most polluted center of the city, or there's a cancer cluster that was found in this historically Black community. And I think going beyond the victim narrative will lead to much richer stories and therefore discussions and hopefully action.
I'd love to add to the personal side of things. I work in a very small newsroom, and there have been several times since I came to WJCT in 2018 where I was the only full-time reporter. So I was doing general assignment, daily reporting on top of these longer form climate stories. And when you're constantly thinking about big challenges like climate change, it can be really hard mentally. And then when the pandemic hit, in a small newsroom, I had to all of a sudden become a health reporter too. So now I'm thinking about two global crises constantly. And it took a big toll on my mental health. And I feel like I'm starting to finally come out of that. But being a journalist is a really, really hard job. And most of us don't get paid very well. So my message is be nice to journalists and be patient with them too.
We're here for you. You want to add anything?
Yeah, I think, usually kind of just thinking about, a lot of times I'll wake up in the middle of the night and be like, how can I say this in a different way? How is this going to resonate? And who am I trying to resonate it with? Is it the people, the wider people? Is it thought leaders? Is it decision makers? Right. How can I tell that story to hit people
Exactly.
in the feels? And so those are the things that, I'll wake up at 2 a.m. and be like, oh, yeah.
I'm here for you too, because my wife would say, you're usually up between 2 and 5, so call me.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, we have a question right there, and I hope there are a few others. Let's make the question short and the responses short, and everybody doesn't have to answer each question. We're not going to do that. Let's see what we can do here.
All right, on the note of being nice to journalists, I want to highlight, thank you so much to everybody. Harry Escobar with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine. Something I want to highlight, having spent 10 years in academia, is the amazing work you all are doing and that you don't necessarily have to do it, especially communicating this data, these scientific facts. I think something important, and I want to ask you, is how to urge the scientific community, both federal and universities, to communicate more clearly, period.
Who do you want to direct that to?
Let's go with Justin.
That's the right answer.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably turn the question back to you, frankly, because I feel like there are some researchers who are really good at communicating, and for better or worse, they often tend to be the people that a lot of journalists call up the same people over and over again. And there's a reason for that. It's because they're good, and because maybe they're good at Twitter, and they're good at sort of reaching out and talking and giving a good quote. I think, you know, I would say obviously there's value, and academics know the value of getting, you know, a media mention. So I would emphasize that to them if they, you know, as a way to urge them. But I guess I would connect with some of the resources perhaps, and I don't have them on my fingertips, but there are a lot of resources that are aimed at, you know, improving science communication and helping researchers connect with journalists. I don't know, these are just off the top of my head. I don't know if others have.
Okay.
I have a couple of suggestions as a TV guy here. You know, I think it's keeping it simple. I think we often want to overtalk, and you know, saying it to somebody like you would say it in a bar. You know, like you tell a friend, you know. And oftentimes, when, and I don't get to do a lot of interviewing anymore, but when I did, as a producer, you know, I would say, can you say that again a little more clearly? Or, you know, kind of guiding it to be very natural speak.
I would add one thing. From my time at The Atlantic, which has some amazing science writers, and you know, Ed Yong better have won the Pulitzer last year for the work that he did on the pandemic. Journalists like to take a study and look immediately to the conclusions and tell the story of the conclusions. If you want to narrativize a study, do the methodology. What was the scientist pursuing? What was the science team pursuing? What were they trying to find? What were the roadblocks that they ran into trying to prove out their to beat down their hypothesis? And how did they get beyond those roadblocks to find what they actually found?
Another question? Here we go. And we will get you all out of here on time. I know Joanna has a plane pretty soon. We're going to make sure she doesn't miss it.
Good morning, afternoon. Thank you, first of all, for a terrific discussion. All of you are report for or write opinions for media outlets of record, you know, New York Times, Time, public radio stations. And as Joanna said, you know, many of you are really looking to tailor your messages to people who listen to you or to thought leaders or whoever in a given day or whatever. How do you layer that on getting messages out to a broader swath of people through things like social media, which is where, unfortunately, most people, for better or worse, let me put it that way, most people get their news. And particularly when you're talking about using your reporting to create a groundswell of demand for action. How do you take your messages that resonate routinely with maybe the, 10 or maybe 20% of very important 10 or 20% with the rest of the folks who don't receive messages in a different way, let me put it that way.
Marilyn, who would you like to direct that to first?
I'm interested in what Matt says because he's reaching out to younger audiences.
Why don't you
But
start?
also I'm interested in what everybody else says
Okay,
as
Matt,
well.
you start.
You know, in some ways, you almost have the answer. You have to think about the platform that you are delivering the story on. So if you looked at the NBCLX TikTok handle, it makes me cringe. But it works. It's what works on that platform. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, they're all have a different kind of style.
But cringe, why does it make you cringe?
Well, it's not news that I consume. So you have to start thinking about the person and the platform and how content is delivered on that platform to be able to produce it that way. The great thing is with TikTok, we use this saying in the industry, it's low rent production. It's not as slick as that video that we put together here because that's what works on that platform.
And I think I know part of the answer, and everybody could weigh in here. Is that medium, pick another one, guiding the content? In other words, the medium sort of dictates the kind of content that begins to happen on there. It's not that it's just blurrier than the other thing. It's actually changing the nature of what constitutes content.
It's guiding the style, but it's not necessarily, if you're still doing a story about sea level rise, you can do that story on TikTok.
Okay.
But you've got to do it with that in mind.
Yeah, okay. Anybody else in response to Marilyn's questions, which was other media forms or things they're using to generate impact?
I think at ProPublica, again, we have engagement reporters. They've used flyers. They've used, you use events, you use WhatsApp, you use, so try to, as you said, try to figure out what people are using and get there. I do think that's a problem across all of us here. I think all of our media outlets are struggling with figuring out how to do this. But I think a combination of all of the above, I think and it depends on the story too, as well.
I think when we look at social media, so I love TikTok personally. I love TikTok. I think when we look at social media, and I think this has been true for decades at this point, when we look at social media, we tend to pay attention to virality and scale. We tend to pay attention to reach, and we tend to ignore depth. We tend to ignore what happens over time. We tend to ignore followers and what makes people follow an account versus what makes people retweet a thing, retweet a tweet. So that lens makes us particularly susceptible to seeing the tweet that went viral or the TikTok that everybody saw, but it actually makes us ignore what drives the algorithm. If you pay attention to TikTok's algorithm, it wants variability. It wants consistency from individual creators to create following over time, but it wants variability for users. It wants to expose users to throw a bunch of different things at you to find out what's at the edges of your attention. And we can make use of that.
Yeah.
To riff off of that, I have teenagers and young, 20s who are on that social media, but their understanding of an issue is so shallow. And so how do you fight that a vast majority is kind of getting consumed on social media, and it is for these complex issues, there is no long form necessarily on this kind of platform. How do you fight that?
So the question, if you can't hear in the back, is these short form media forms create a certain shallowness of understanding of big issues. How do you manage that? I think you were being pointed to by our friend here in the front row.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, for one thing, who are the folks that you're talking to following? And so look for who is successful at creating depth. The stereotype of YouTube a decade ago was that YouTube would be a place where, it's images, it's the rise of the image, the fall of the world, it's Neil Postman, it's like the apotheosis of Neil Postman's amusing ourselves to death, that YouTube was going to create this superficial, shallow consumption area. And what we found instead is that YouTube is particularly given to pushing audiences into rabbit holes, that it's very good at tunneling people deep, deep, deep into something so that they have this incredible depth on this, what might be a conspiracy theory, but shallowness across a range of things. But that also means that YouTube is given to hour-long video essays about subjects that no one would have expected 10 years ago with that stereotype, that you could trend on YouTube, you could get 1 million views for an hour-long video essay about something. And so I think when you're engaging young folks with social media, pointing them away from the viral thing that they're going to get when they open up the app and towards the creator that's actually doing in-depth work can be a way that you...
I'd love to add on to this because I don't think this is an issue that is exclusive to young people. I think this is a society-wide issue. And I don't think any of us have a good answer for it. If we did, I don't think outlets like the Daily Wire would be as successful as they are. You know, I think most people, they want that quick bite-sized thing. And even when you have these longer form things, for example, like the Joe Rogan show, like those are really long episodes that lots of people listen to, but they're still very shallow. Like they're not actually going into the issue and trying to really understand it. They're just giving these little sound bites and these thoughts about an issue that don't really tackle it fully.
So we're going to do one last question, and then we will have you out of here in a few minutes afterwards. So those of you looking at your watches, promise you that will be true.
I hope this is a quick one, but I think I would love everyone to answer it, is how can we in municipalities and businesses looking at resilience, looking at climate, how can we deliver a story to you in a way that is something y'all could pick up? What could we do better to help y'all write our stories?
Great question. How about Joanna? Somebody has information. They want you to do something with it.
And I would say this from a guise of opinion. So I'm probably not going to direct quote you. I'm talking to people. A lot of times I talk to people off the record just because I'm like, I want to know what's driving your deal. What makes you think? Why do you think this is the way to go? And I want people to be candid with me because I don't necessarily have to direct quote people. I can put that all into an opinion piece and say, this is the way we need to go because of X, Y, and Z. You know, so I'm just looking for thoughts. And so people that are willing to be candid with me, who are willing to tell me, not that you're trying to sensationalize something and like, or try to get an agenda, because I'll see through that pretty quick. I can figure that kind of thing out. But let me know really what's going on. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't candy coat it. A lot of times you'll get the sort of, you know, staid municipal response, which is like, nothing to see here. Cows turn themselves inside out every day. You know, it's sort of like that South Park quote, right? You know, it's that sort of thing. No, like, tell me what's going on. Tell me what's going on so that I can understand where you're coming from. And then I can talk to other people who may have different perspectives and put all that together into, okay, if these people are over here and these people are over here, what's the thing that could draw them together? That's kind of my job. And so, yeah, it's just really being, you know, tell me the story. Tell me what's on your mind. Tell me what's going on so I can understand it. And I'll go deep with you. Like, I'm one of those people, especially with water, like, I get wonky and nerdy. I don't write wonky or nerdy, but I want to understand it so I can really tell that story.
And Brendan and Perla, I'm suspecting you get a lot of people directly getting in touch with you, like was just suggested.
Yeah, so I would suggest don't just send a formal generic email. I feel like some of the people up here probably get even more emails than me, but I get hundreds of emails a day with story pitches, and most of them are so stupid. So most of the emails, I just kind of like glance at them, I ignore them, I delete them, or I come back to them later. So
We're tweeting right now what you said about your readership.
I'm not talking about my readers, I'm talking about PR people. So I would say try to establish a relationship and give us a call or text us or try to meet us for coffee or lunch or something, because we get so many emails. I'm tired of getting emails.
I would second that building relationships, and I think it's both ways, and access, you know, giving reporters access to the way you're doing the work, to the data, to your people. It's, you know, it's a story off a press release is not going to be as strong as a story, so as much as access as you can give us into what you're doing, I think that would help.
Just to add one thought is I sometimes use the phrase lower ambition, right? So if you reach out, don't expect that it's going to lead to a story tomorrow. It might be about building a relationship that could lead to a story in 6 months, or maybe it's just for you, you know, a quote in a story, or it's just insight, you know, just insight that informs my story. It's oftentimes really like, you know, I'll speak to somebody, or, you know, and they'll say, well, why didn't you quote me? And because that's not what the agreement is. Like, you know, this is about helping inform the work that we're doing as journalists.
Thought from the mats? Either one?
I mean, I would say that it's not just journalists. The dirty little truth of journalism is that Often the most effective public communicators are going to be the people that we quote. So I would say, generally, you can't hurt yourself by getting better at public communication, getting better at storytelling, getting better at telling your own story, if what you want is to be picked up by a broader press. The truth is, all of us are influencers now, for better or for worse. And so what does that mean for how you communicate?
I would just add, personalize the relationship. Make it something where you've got a connection with the reporter you're doing. And, I think maybe this is not a warning, it's more of advice. As a former investigative reporter, one of my favorite things to do after a huge investigative piece was to open records request all of your emails about my story. And some of the things that people said about me, I couldn't believe. It was just good reading. But I mean, know that if you end up being the subject of something that you don't want out, transparency has got to be key. You've got to be clear and honest, and don't try to hide it.